everybody. Hi. Welcome. If I sniffle a little, forgive me. I live in a house with 2 small children in daycare, so it's like all winter is like this. So we are starting with a quote. I enlisted in the American Ambulance Corps, as did 9/10 of the volunteers, because I had no job and saw no prospect of obtaining one. There was no quixotic urge to render the world safe for democracy. The motive was a thoroughly selfish one, coming from need of occupation and distraction for the moment. The idea had been crystallizing for some time, but it seemed as if 3 important essentials were lacking. I spoke little French, the sight of any wound had always made me rather ill, and I couldn't drive an automobile. The powers that be assured me that these things didn't matter in the least, so I signed up and left home on October 25th, 1916. Let's make sure this is actually on. So I'm going to set a scene for you. Let's see if it goes. Does it go? Nope.
Yeah, you have to put it here.
Is it plugged in?
It is definitely plugged in.
Aha! There we go, guys. Still not going?
Sorry, hold on.
This absolutely worked in our run through.
Yeah.
Do you need someone to do the slides?
I don't know. The light came on, right?
Yeah, it's definitely on.
Push
Want
it
to do it manually from the computer?
Do you want to just do the slides?
Or if you have a mouse, Laura, I can use that. We can start again in a moment. It was a false start.
I'll just say a few intermission moment. Jeff was at Armistice Day in France, and he just was telling me about how exciting it was. You didn't bring the ambulance with you?
We don't tell anyone. Tone of silence. We borrowed an ambulance. There are 3 or 4 of these still around in Europe, and we're friendly with most of them.
But in any case, Jeff essentially represented the United States in a very powerful way, was brought up by the French to sit with the generals. He was also at the service on Armistice Day when others from the United States were not there because of the weather. Okay.
All right. So I'm going to try again. I'm going to set a scene. I stood at the work table near my desk over a black leather binder open to the first yellow page. I was hardly believing my own good luck. I had just pulled a fairly unassuming box out of our special collections room, which I assumed contained a small amount of material on World War I. What I found instead was an unpublished manuscript, 156 pages interspersed with over 100 original photographs. I counted them by hand. I don't know why I did that. It was an extensive first-hand account of a man named Gordon Ware's service in World War I. There's Gordon right there. Now, my training is as a historian, and every historian dreams of that once-in-a-lifetime find, that trove of undiscovered letters, or the handwritten first drafts, or the lost recordings of an important subject. I was pretty sure that I was standing over my find. I was 29 years old and theoretically had a very long career above me, so maybe I peaked just a little bit early. But that's okay, because I was really happy. If the find was exciting as a historian, as a curator of Gordon Ware's manuscript, the first paragraph of which I just read to you was nothing short of a godsend. Here I was, desperately searching our collections for items relating to a subject that I have to admit I personally did not care very much for. I was working on this World War I exhibition, the one that's right behind me. I hope many of you have seen it. And if you know me, you've probably heard me say at least once that military history is not my favorite subject. I was pretty stumped by World War I, actually. I couldn't think of an interesting or novel way to approach it at all. All I could think of was an exhibit that was focused on abstract and, seeming to me, uninteresting numbers. You know, this many men from Framingham enlisted, this many war bonds were sold, we planted this many victory gardens. But finding this manuscript, which was funny, and it was personal, and it was really human, basically focused me. I was able to think about the subject in a totally different way. I didn't have to be confined to these abstract numbers and concepts. I could hone in on the people, and I could think about the way that these more abstract concepts affected them concretely in their everyday lives. And with over 150 pages of writing and photos, Gordon Ware touched on nearly every subject that I hoped to cover in the exhibition. Technology, trench warfare, contributions from home, health and sanitation, patriotism, disillusionment. With such a gold mine of content, Gordon essentially became the exhibition's second narrator. If you've looked closely, you may have noticed his quotes and photos scattered all over the walls. Now, at some point in the past, somebody must have known about this manuscript. It was there. It had been accepted into our collection in 1997 and was sitting comfortably in an archival storage container, so we were definitely taking good care of it. But as far as I could tell, nobody had thought too much about it since. Because the box that I found it was incorrectly labeled George Ware, so whoever stored it didn't even get the author's name right. To be fair, our internal collections database outputs over 19,000 records. It's virtually impossible to get everything exactly right when you're faced with that kind of volume. I'd like to pretend that I am a research genius who knew exactly the spot to look and everything that needed to be done to uncover a treasure like this. But if I'm honest, sometimes finding things like this, it's just dumb luck. So, before we delve into the contents of the manuscript in more detail, I'd like to give you a sense of its format and condition. Sorry. What we're talking about is an unfinished, unpublished manuscript, compiled primarily from the letters that Gordon Ware wrote home. I'm pretty sure mostly to his sister. The tone is generally playful and sardonic. Ware frequently refers to himself in asides as our hero and the pilgrim. And it includes pithy captions with many of his photos. This one says that he and his cohort are appropriately photographed at the zoo. The format is slightly inconsistent, mostly due to the fact that it was never finished and therefore never edited. Although it mostly reads like an epistolary novel, just like an old form of novel written in the form of letters, there are some sections that were pulled from wartime diaries that are sparser in detail and slightly different in tone than the letter sections of the manuscript. The inconsistency in format is even clearer when you consider the chapters, such as they are. The first half is fairly consistently broken up into short chapters with headers that generally describe the action covered in that section. So this new one I'm bringing up here. In which the ship docks, board at Bordeaux. Paris receives the pilgrim undemonstratively. The volunteer cocoon and the butterfly. He meets red tape, renews acquaintance with the Ford, becomes intimate, social distractions, a licensed menace to traffic. About halfway through the manuscript, he abandons the chapter format altogether and uses only the dates of his letters to distinguish one section from another. So now, let's talk about Gordon. Gordon Ware was born September 21st, 1886, to Arthur Lovell Ware and Alice Jack Ware. Alice was the same Alice Jacks who, if you've seen our Civil War exhibit at all, she was the winner of the Flora McFlimsy doll and wardrobe that are on exhibit right now back there. So if you have a chance to check them out, I would recommend it. Alice's father was the cashier of the Framingham Bank, and her mother was a Miriam. And the Miriams are a family that had been in Framingham since just after the Revolution. Arthur was a Harvard-educated man who hailed from Milton, Massachusetts, and he settled with his wife, who was from Framingham, and his two children, Gordon and Margaret, in Framingham on Mill Street. It's number 110 Mill. It's still standing today. In the 1910 census documents, the Ware household also included a parlor maid, a laundress, a chambermaid, a gardener, a coachman, and his whole family. The elder Ware listed his occupation as own income, which as far as I can tell meant that he was independently wealthy. He must have developed a sense of decorum before the next census though, because he listed his occupation as general farmer, and only 3 slightly less ostentatious sounding servants were listed as members of his household. This is the warehouse, an architectural drawing of the warehouse on Mill Street from 1913 that's in our collection. And you can see that it was referred to as the Ware Cottage. It is a very, very large house. Gordon grew up in this privileged atmosphere, attending the prestigious Milton Academy and then Harvard, just as his father did before him. At Harvard, he was a member of the social club, the Institute of 1770, which was very prestigious and which has since been absorbed into the Hasty Pudding, which might be slightly more recognizable to you. Despite his economic, social, and educational advantages, Gordon was, like many of the young men of his time, restless. After school, he held a series of largely clerical jobs, the most significant of which was at the Alumni House at Harvard. But he didn't really settle into any particular career. By the time war broke out in Europe in 1914, Gordon was 28, with no future prospects, and apparently very little real ambition. 2 years later, he made the decision, as the introduction of his memoir states, from need of occupation and distraction for the moment, to enlist as a volunteer driver with the American Ambulance Field Service. Despite proclaimed American neutrality in the early years of the war, there were Americans serving overseas with the Allied forces from the very beginning of the conflict, primarily as medical volunteers, nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers. The American Ambulance Field Service, later just called the American Field Service, was one of the primary sources of American involvement during this period. In 1904, wealthy Americans living in Paris established the American Hospital in Paris, which you'll see behind me, and it's still standing today, to serve the American expat community in France. I guess they didn't think that French doctors and hospitals were good enough for Americans, which is very typical of us. When war broke out 10 years later, the hospital began to support the French military while remaining staffed primarily by Americans. That same year, hospital staff also established an additional civilian-run wartime hospital called the American Ambulance Hospital. And this is a kind of fun aside about words. Ambulance is actually the French term for a temporary military hospital. So a field hospital that would be on the move was called an ambulance. And so our current understanding of an ambulance actually involves a little bit of word drift, going from the hospital itself to the sort of transport to the hospital. The ambulance driver would drive you to that hospital. And it also, I believe, and I guess Jeff could correct me if I was wrong, at Gordon's time they didn't do a lot of first aid in the ambulances. They just transported. But today, now, a modern ambulance is a mobile sort of mini doctor's office, if you will. So that's just a little history, a little linguistic history for you. In 1915, the American Ambulance Hospital began recruiting drivers to stay closer to the front and transport the wounded to the hospital. These drivers originally only served the American Ambulance Hospital, but the American Ambulance Field Service, as it came to be called, quickly expanded to posts wherever the French army served. 2,500 Americans eventually volunteered as drivers with the Ambulance Corps, and it became the largest American ambulance corps serving overseas before the U.S. actually entered the war. Over the first 3.5 years of war, the American volunteers in Europe evacuated over 400,000 Allied casualties. When the United States officially entered the war, the American Field Service was absorbed into the U.S. Army Ambulance Service, and many of the volunteer drivers were commissioned as officers. When he enlisted in the Field Service, Gordon was participating in a trend among Ivy League educated men. Of the 2,500 volunteers that came from America for the Field Service, nearly 900 had come directly from Ivy League schools. They didn't even graduate, dropped what they were doing, left Princeton and Harvard and Cornell, and went overseas. The roster of former field service ambulance drivers reads like a who's who of lost generation literati. Their likes include E.E. Cummings, Ernest Hemingway, and Harry Crosby. See what I did there? I put Gordon in with them. There are a number of motives that are ascribed to this trend among this particular set of men. A desire for adventure, a sense of duty, the concept that these important institutions are instilling higher values in this group of men. But Ware, for his part, had a totally different view of the matter. He wrote, "Anyone who volunteered did so from individual motives, and it had nothing to do with Harvard. The majority would have amounted to nothing at home, and came over here because of restlessness. And even those who have died, and died bravely, could very well have Sidney Carton's last words for an epitaph." Sidney Carton is the character from A Tale of Two Cities who sacrifices himself at the end of the book. He famously says, "'Tis a far, far better thing that I do now than I have ever done before." "Neither is an especial credit to Harvard," said Gordon. "The glamour goes over here, and while they live and die bravely and are a great crowd, they would have been precious little use to the community at large." It's a pretty cynical point of view. Perhaps his view on it was colored by his own motives, which you may remember he called thoroughly selfish. But I get the sense that he had a decent read on the men that he was serving with, and that the Ivy League crowd was more restless than anything else. Young men from lower class backgrounds didn't have the luxury of becoming restless, but an elite Ivy League educated young man had the time for the kind of existential crisis that might lead you to run off to war long before you needed to. Gordon departed for France in October of 1917. This is 7 months before President Wilson would ask Congress to declare war. After his arrival in Paris, he underwent a 1-month training period during which he tested for a French driver's license. He called the process a farce. He learned to repair and tune up the Ford Model Ts that served as their ambulances, and he generally wreaked havoc on the streets of Paris. He wrote, "The day after getting my license, I celebrated by stalling 4 times running, which I guess is my normal performance. Yesterday I did a good do. I tickled the rear end of a taxi driver as he was stooping over to fix a tire in a bad place in traffic, and I learned some new French words. I consider taxi drivers fair game, as you rarely get a chance to put anything over them, and I doubt if a jury would convict you if you killed one." It would take Ware a while to get the hang of driving. He recorded many instances that made it clear exactly how limited his experience behind the wheel was before he arrived in Paris. "Our cars have been awarded and are all ready. I am the proud owner of number 406, which is undoubtedly a perfectly good car, but I can't start it. When someone does this for me, if I don't immediately stall her, she charges off erratically into the most substantial object in the immediate vicinity, to its or her detriment, according to their relative consistency." He later christened his car Ophelia, and he wrote about her very fondly. After training, Ware was faced with a choice. He could ship out immediately to the Western Front, or he could wait a little longer and ship out to the Balkans with Section 10, a group that was being led by his friend Henry Suckley. They would be going via the Greek port of Salonique. This here is an admittedly disembodied map of Greece, not France, sorry. Salonique is today called Thessaloniki or Salonika, and I think, if I recall correctly, this part works just fine. Does it? Here we go.
There you go.
So there's Salonique up there. It's a port city in Greece. And there are a lot of things that it's been called over time. I'm going to continue calling it Salonique for simplicity's sake, because that's what Gordon called it, I assume because of the French influence serving with the ambulance corps. He made this decision, although it would delay his foray into the action, which many men were anxious to see, because there is every prospect of more doing down there in the immediate future than on the West Front, and the opportunity to see that country cannot occur again. As an added inducement, many of Ware's friends who he had met during training in the field service were going with the same section down to Salonique. He left Paris just after Christmas, arriving in Salonique in January, on January 10th. His travels were largely uneventful, but he does offer this gem of a story from his train ride from Paris to Marseille. We have just passed through Beaune, a little town on the other side of Dijon. Immediately before arriving, one of our French mechanics began walking up and down the aisle asking the conductor, "On s'arrête là?" And in French that means, "Are we stopping here?" We did not stop, but as we slowed down, he shouted to the station agent, "Tell Madame Chauvet that her husband passed through on this train." Then he cheerfully went back to his checkers. C'est la guerre, but it nearly makes you weep. Salonique was the Allied stronghold in the Balkans. So I gave you a bigger map of Europe to sort of place you. The front in the Balkans is a little-known theater of operations that went by many names. The Salonika Front, the Macedonian Front, or most poignantly, the Forgotten Front. You may think that that last one is a modern invention because we, especially as Americans, hear so little about combat in that part of Europe. But the Forgotten Front was in fact largely forgotten by the two opposing sides as the war was happening. For those who don't remember, World War I began with a conflict between Austria and Serbia. I'm going to give you a little geography for us while we're at it. This is Austria-Hungary, and then Serbia is over here. Serbian terrorist Gavrilo Princip assassinated the heir to the throne of the Habsburg Empire, Franz Ferdinand. Allied forces occupied the Balkans in the hopes of pushing back an Austrian invasion of Serbia. So they established this front. They established a front that stretched from the Adriatic Sea across Albania. Oops. Oh, now it's working. All right, cool. Albania, Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria. Bulgaria, which had originally declared itself neutral in the war, soon allied itself with the Central Powers and became the primary Central Powers combatant in the region. The two sides would be entrenched along this front over several years, with very little real movement on either side during most of this time. Despite being at the real heart of the conflict, the Salonika front was a low priority for the Allies, who were much more concerned with the fronts of the war that established itself on their doorsteps, mainly the Western Front. Got France here, Germany here, Great Britain here. They don't care about what's going on down here. The Army of the Orient, as it was called, that was posted around and in Salonique languished for 3 years, making very few gains and eventually having about 166,000 combat fatalities, which is more than America saw at all in combat during the war. Ware acutely felt the lack of organization when he arrived in Salonique, writing, "My last diary entry contains the remark that I left Boston 3 months ago, and I wish I hadn't done so, or at any rate had stopped in Paris. And that is true. I am totally disgusted with this organization, or lack of it, and that of the French army, which would doubtless cause them great grief if they suspected my disapproval. Why, if we were so specifically needed here, they can't get our cars to us, which have been lying in the harbor for 2 weeks, I don't see." The fighting in the Balkans didn't play out until a shakeup in Allied command with renewed troop morale and vigor. And that was also just as war fatigue was breaking in Bulgaria, which fielded the bulk primarily of the Central Power troops. The Allies made a bold push into Bulgaria in 1918, taking the country in September of that year, and an immediate German retreat led the Bulgarians to surrender. Ware's experience as an American serving in this theater of the war is incredibly unique. By the time the US got into the conflict in 1917 and deployed troops overseas, Salonika was basically already in the process of wrapping up. American troops were all pretty much sent to the Western Front on the border of France and Germany, and American infantry never saw Salonika. Additionally, the forces he served alongside were the most diverse the war would see. The Army of the Orient was made up of French, English, Russian, Italian, Greek, and Serbian nationals. But it also included troops from these countries' various imperial colonies. So this included Algerians and Indians and Senegalese. Seen in the context of imperialism and the outright racist structures that were involved therein, it's very little surprise that these troops were sent to what was perhaps the most underserved front of the war. Ware notes of the black troops that he met, up to date, life for them is just one damn wretch after another. War has little glory for them. It can make little difference who wins, and they are frankly retained for dirty work in camp and field. Ware may have been serving with this diverse force. That didn't really mean that he was a forward thinker. While much of his manuscript is imbued with great empathy, he was really lacking in racial sensitivity. His assessment of the troops of color he encountered was infused with racism, which extended to everybody he met who was not of a Western European background. He refers to the people of Salonique as a national hash, retaining all the worst features of the racial ingredients. He disparages Jews, Greeks, African troops. He uses multiple racial slurs that the woman who was transcribing the work for me would not even transcribe. This aspect of the manuscript can make it a difficult read, but it's really characteristic of the attitudes of the predominantly white Western powers that were the driving forces behind the war. Ware's attitude was a microcosm of the attitude that all of these higher powers really had when they sent these troops to Salonika. If Ware thought that he was bound for glamorous adventure and exotic locales, his arrival at camp in Salonique quickly disabused him of that notion. He describes the conditions in his tent in very vivid detail. He writes, "Mud is feet deep, and under the tin slab I sleep on, a pleasant torrent drains through. To appreciate this, read French Camp Sanitation. It's either out of print or hasn't been written yet. From the 5-gallon standard oil tins that the gasoline comes in, we have made a stove for each tent, but they give out more smoke than heat, and insecurely propped up on bricks are a constant menace to safety. Besides, fuel is almost non-existent." He then goes on to recommend a way for his family back home to recreate his experience at camp. "Try camping out in our swamp on a rainy day, when the wind cuts as it used to last winter near Harvard Bridge. Then get Mr. Bradley to contribute a couple of tons of his aromatic fertilizer. Import some diseased dogs, but vocally in excellent shape, children and adults similarly inclined, and you will have the setting for a magazine article entitled Salonique, the Pearl of the Hellenes. The Hellenes. Why we don't get everything from cholera to housemaid's knee under existing circumstances, I don't see. The only sanitary thing about the section is its name." The conditions were made worse by his sense of being totally useless. Without their cars, which were left in the harbor for over a month, the ambulance section was totally arrested, with no drive or purpose. His time was mostly spent, in his own words, loafing. "We literally don't leave our beds all day, except for meals, so-called, because by that means we keep comparatively warm and dry. Occasionally, we saunter downtown, but the inches of mud underfoot and the quartz splashed on you from the passing stream of motors renders this a very, very doubtful pleasure, especially as there's little to do there except drink tea and avoid a great desire to drown one's sorrows in rum in a cafe that would disgrace a metropolis like South Framingham." He thought very highly of Framingham. Just as he was disconnected from his own purpose, Gordon was beginning to feel disconnected from the whole conflict. Despite being at camp in what was ostensibly the center of Allied operations in the region, Ware had very little sense of the big picture. There's a cafe in the old quarter where he wants to drown his sorrows in rum. Here's a wrecked Zeppelin blimp on the waterfront. "We know nothing about the war, and could say nothing if we did. I guess you know more details as usual. The nearer you get to the scene of the action, the further away you seem. Only uniforms remind us of it, as news doesn't exist. It is also a matter of course. A dirty business, shorn of all its glamour, to be gotten through as quickly as possible. So even though he was faced daily with the wreckage of war, this over here is called the White Tower, which is a pretty significant landmark in Salonique. And there was a wrecked Zeppelin right in front of him, right in the city, and yet he felt this disconnect from the conflict. This sentiment was not limited to his time spent waiting for his car in Salonique. Even while he was on the front lines, he expressed a sense of detachment from the conflict that one can't help but feel is a coping mechanism for the reality of what he found himself facing daily. And what he faced was both tedious and terrifying. When the ambulances finally arrived at port in Salonique, Ware's section quickly departed to serve in Albania, where they transported wounded from the front to hospitals in Zemblak and Korica. So these are, this caption just kills me, waiting for an attack. This is the Red Cross camp that, according to Gordon, was bombed daily. He describes driving the wounded. These are evacuation roads here. It's an evacuation road. He had to drive the wounded over this road. And then this over here is actually a river that he had to drive a Ford Model T across to get the soldiers to the hospital. It's a nightmare. You sweat blood just driving, trying to avoid each pebble. The first load I saw go by was driven by Mackenzie, whom one could not class as an emotional sort. But the tears were streaming down his face simply at the thought of how he must be jolting the men inside. They never complain and seldom cry out. You could hardly hear them if they did, and men could, and do, die inside without your being the wiser till you reach the hospital. It must be ghastly, lying there helpless, and constantly dreading the next bump to bring them new agonies. So this is them actually loading a wounded soldier up into the back of an ambulance. You can't see him that clearly, but he's right there. It's not clear exactly what he thought wartime service would be like, but the reality certainly did not match up with the existing American impression of soldiering. The men, he noted, were inexperienced, filthy, tired, they were scared. While the gullible public thinks we drink coffee full of bullets and chew gunpowder to make us fierce, take an unwashed man, give him a rickety jitney bus full of invalids, tear up the Framingham Turnpike, and let him drive over it twice a day, and then you'll have the true picture. It's very safe. You can see how safe it was to drive this ambulance. Gordon had been in the service for 5 months by the time the U.S. officially joined the fray. Although he had initially signed up to stay in the Balkans until October, his section was called back to Paris in July, so the Americans could either re-enlist as ambulance drivers in Europe or return home to enlist in the infantry and learn to dig trenches before they were brought back overseas. On August 10, 1917, exactly 7 months after his arrival in Salonique, Gordon Ware arrived back in Paris and was given command of Ambulance Corps Section 33 on the Western Front in Argonne. While he was there, he was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French military, although the circumstances of that I'm not exactly sure of. We'll discuss later. Then in November, Ware's section was absorbed by the U.S. Army Ambulance Service, and Ware was commissioned as a lieutenant. He was put in charge of Section 645, and he served there in that capacity throughout the remainder of the war, at one point sustaining a severe chest injury in an ambulance crash, which was clearly fairly common if his photos from Albania are to be believed. After the war, he transferred to the Diplomatic Courier Service, which was also called the Silver Greyhounds, and for a time he ran their office in Bern, Switzerland during the peace process. Finally, he was discharged and returned home in June of 1919. When Gordon got home, he took up teaching. He became a master at the Pomfret School in Connecticut. Does anyone know that school? Yeah. Like many of the other men who served with him, he began to compile his wartime letters and diaries into a memoir. Itching to return to Europe when the school year ended, he lined up a position of responsibility. I don't actually know what that means, but he was going to be working for a bank, and that would necessitate annual trips abroad to France, which he was very excited about. He took a vacation in August of 1920. Oh no. Okay. Well, now we have multiple ways to do this, so. He took a vacation in August of 1920 before his job was to begin to visit two of his uncles in Europe. It was on this trip in Paris that Gordon suddenly took ill, likely related to the chest injury he sustained during the war, and died suddenly at the age of 34. And you can see this is a blown up version, picture of his passport photo. And he had aged significantly between the photo that you see of him in, I think is a 1917 photo, and this photo here from 1920. So it's really, really drastic. His manuscript was only partially finished, making it just through his service in Albania and then abruptly stopping. What he saw on the Western Front, or the details of his injury, or the circumstances under which he earned the Croix de Guerre are all going to remain a mystery. His sister, in whose hands the work fell after his death, wrote at the end of the manuscript, G.W. had edited his own letters thus far, to be typewritten in this form. From now on, the work has to be done by one who can only try to choose the extracts that he would have wished to use himself from a short diary and from his letters. That work was never done. And without access to Gordon's letters, which we lack, it likely never will be. The Ware's direct line would die in 1970 with Margaret, Gordon's sister, who never had any children. She entrusted the manuscript to her friend Ellen Shaw, who then gave it to the Framingham Historical Society in 1997. And so I found myself, 20 years later, standing over this manuscript, holding an utterly unique, hilarious, poignant, and sadly unfinished account of a Framingham man at war. There are some things about the memoir itself, and not just about, well, it's a little about Gordon too, that I'd like to discuss. The first is the name that Gordon gave it. He called it, What Did You Do in the Great War, Father? This title was a cheeky take on a common refrain that originated with this 1914 British recruitment poster. You can tell from his writing that Gordon didn't care much for war, which is like a silly and simplistic thing to say because I'm not sure anyone would, but he had very little reverence for what was a rather grim experience. In fact, he was generally inclined to make light of his experiences there. So I showed you this photo of an upturned ignorance before, but I cut out his captions. Yeah. By adopting this line as the name of his manuscript, Ware was taking the sense of respect that was inherent in the question, what did you do in the Great War, and turning it on its head. He does this again with his introduction, which denies his volunteerism was connected to any kind of lofty ideal. He continues to subvert this traditional veneration of soldiers and service at basically every opportunity, and yet he expressively conveys the sense of tragedy that's inherent in war, while maintaining his own tongue-in-cheek sense of humor. It's this aspect of the manuscript that I really treasure the most, Gordon's voice. The whole thing is infused with such genuine emotion. He's honest, he's scared, he's bored, he's tired, he's cynical, and he's very funny. You may already have an idea of Gordon's sense of humor by now. I've given you a little taste, but I do think it bears calling out directly. His photo captions and chapter titles are real gems. My favorite, perhaps, being that of chapter 8, when he arrives in Salonique, which starts with a poem. With mountain eyes that seem to hold the freshness of the world of old. A shepherd's crook, a coat of fleece. A grazing flock, the sense of peace. The long, sweet silence, this is Greece. Which is all very pretty, but which does not at all describe Salonique, which I shall proceed to do vividly. It's good. And here's another sample from his time in Caritza. At present, it is very cold, and is evidently the starting place of the Boston east winds. Bathing suffers, but the sun appeared enough today to strip to the waist in our courtyard and use the water our elderly hostess pumped for me in return for some petrol. I am sure she is smitten with my manly form, as she slapped me coquettishly on the shoulder at parting, which I imagine is pretty hot stuff in Albania. He was also known among his friends and fellow soldiers for his comedic antics. During his time with the Silver Greyhounds, Gordon wrote a letter, and I only found this while developing this because it wasn't in his manuscript, I just found it somewhere else. He was parodying the economic opportunism that resulted from the power vacuum after the war. In the letter, he presents himself as Charlie Skadovich, a businessman who wants to establish a cat ranch for the sale of cat skins, and which he insists would be a self-perpetuating business if only they established a rat ranch next to the cat ranch, so the cats could eat the rats, and the rats could eat the cats, and they could all reproduce at natural levels. These moments of humor are interspersed with truly beautiful writing. Ware clearly had a natural gift for description, and he managed to find great beauty even in the throes of warfare. He describes a dogfight in terms so beautiful that it almost sounds pleasant. Just as we were sitting down, two Boche, which means German, planes came over, tiny specks in the clear sky, pursued by bursts of anti-aircraft shells that exploded so quietly around the planes and looked so soft and cottony that it was hard to realize a hit would mean disaster to the pilot. None such was made, however, and they were soon out of sight, nothing remaining but fading, fleecy bits of smoke, marking the course the observers had taken. He was clearly actually very taken with airplanes in general, which he had never seen before arriving in Europe. He found such incredible beauty in their movements. He also wrote, "It is an unbelievable thing for an American to see." The day was ideal, so a dozen aeroplanes were in the air, circling around the fields. The machines are smaller than I had expected, like dragonflies, and as beautiful. The bodies of polished light wood are shaped much like a fish. It is fascinating to watch them glide about, some at great speed, others almost motionless or volplaning earthwards with the motor off, only to catch up again with a roar when near the ground. He also waxed poetic about the Balkan countryside, an alpine landscape that seemed worlds away from the more demure topography of eastern Massachusetts. He wrote of the Peristeri Pass, and he took lots of photos of it. I can only imagine what it must have looked like in color. It was a green valley, dotted with infinitesimal houses, and watered by a thread of rivers that ran off to flow into Lake Ostrovo, sun-touched in the distance. And as far as the eye could reach were ranges of mountains, following no regular folds, but arranged like waves in a tide rip. Passages like these make me think that Ware could have really made a name for himself as a writer, if only he had lived long enough. He could have joined so many of his ambulance-driving cohorts as an important voice of the lost generation. And in fact, all the hallmarks of the lost generation writers are present in Ware's work. A privileged young man feels restless. He chases adventure at war. When faced with the reality of war, the loss, the trauma, the lasting impact on their psyche, he becomes disillusioned with the ideals he fostered before. He rejects the stories of glory, patriotism, democracy, and the American dream. As you read Ware's work, you get the sense that he was always chasing something that didn't really exist. A glorious adventure that happened to be lurking wherever he was not. Instead, he spent his time looking loss and suffering directly in the face. He saw it in the faces of the men that he transported. He saw it in the faces of his own friends, and he saw it in the faces of the enemy. To me, one of the most striking photographs from the manuscript is this one. This is the German pilot who killed Ware's good friend and section leader Henry Suckley in a bomb attack. Ware was very affected by his friend's death, and the way he unabashedly photographs this man at such close range, and the look that he captured on the pilot's face, and the chaos that surrounds him is all very affecting. This is the real war that Gordon experienced. The chaos, the loss, the sense that you could reach out and touch the devil's face if you just wanted to. By the time he learned that the US had declared war, Gordon was well and thoroughly disenchanted with the whole project. He wrote about the news, "I must say, we couldn't get much of a thrill out of the announcement here. There aren't many thrills in this damn game, as a modern declaration of war merely means a determination to turn out more ammunition than the next fellow, and either get shot up or contract vermin and trench feet. George Cohan can wave his flag, And patriotic song singers can fill in at the movies, but it's a long, dull, grinding, wearing down process, and the hurrah boys element has no place in the picture. If this isn't the voice of the lost generation speaking to us, then I don't know what is. So. Here's the question, how are we on time? 2:50. All right. So I have some bonus content here that is a long, uninterrupted passage from the memoir, because I gave you lots of little quotes, but nothing more extended. Are you guys interested? And there's some more photos too, if you guys are interested in hearing it. Yeah? Okay. So I chose this section of the manuscript. It's near the end of Gordon's time in Albania. And I chose it because I feel like it fairly succinctly demonstrates many of the qualities of Gordon's writing all in one contained passage. It has beautiful descriptive language. It has a sympathetic human element. It's very honest about the impact of war. It has some of his signature, slightly macabre humor. And it tells a really interesting story. So here we go. Just to show what a comic opera war it is, I passed a whole morning last week about 12 kilometers beyond the French outposts, and perhaps 8 from the so-called Boche lines. It sounds devilish, doesn't it? Yet our main concern was whether we had enough wine for lunch. The object of the trip was to rob a monastery, which sounds as if we were adopting Boche methods. I hold no brief for it, but there were extenuating circumstances which came about in this wise. About 30 kilometers northwest of us, in advance of our lines, lies the town of Muscopol. It is said to be 2,000 years old, and the oldest town in Albania, famous for owning and operating the first printing press in the region. It is a Christian settlement built in an inaccessible spot as protection against the Turks, and lately has been the summer resort of rich people of Karitsa, as it is a cool and pleasant spot, sort of a tuxedo, I imagine. And undoubtedly, a special mule train ran out there after the stock exchange closed here. Anyway, last October, the Austrians were there, and as they were good, ardent Catholics, and Muscopol possessed some 25 Protestant churches, they tried a little Spanish Inquisition stuff, doubtless with the idea of propitiating their celestial ally, with whom the Kaiser still claims a speaking acquaintance. They therefore tore things up generally, shot those of the 5,000 inhabitants they could hit, and chased the remnants to refuge here. Undoubtedly, from a Teuton point of view, a good time was had by all. Our lieutenant, who was like a kid out of school, learned that the general of our division had his eye on some souvenirs in one of the sacked churches, and thought he'd pay a surprise visit and get a first crack. Asked me to go with him. We were a quaint party, 6 of us, including a Protestant minister and 2 Fords, all with revolvers, besides 4 guns, as Komitaji is like bandits, they're anti-Ottoman bandits, rebel bands in the Balkans, had fired at the lieutenant when he had made a reconnoitering trip a few days previous. It was a beautiful ride, way up in the air to the pine belt, beautiful waterfalls seeping out of the curiously folded rock strata in the pink soil. A grinning Senegalese yelled, "Good morning, sir," and marked the end of the French line. And in half an hour, we came on our objective, spread on a big plateau halfway up a mountain, a beautiful but most inaccessible spot. At a distance, the town had a curious appearance. As the inevitable red roofs did not top any of the houses, when we arrived, this was explained. There were no roofs. Walls alone were standing, and in many cases, they were reduced to a pile of stones. Grass and poppies grew in the streets and the interiors of the houses, but the destruction was complete. Not one single house was spared, and such systematic ruining would have done credit to the Germans themselves. It was more dismal than any cave ruin I ever saw. La Cité des Morts, as the little priest said softly. Shells, fire, and the hand of man had all contributed to the completeness of the thing. We entered one of the churches, in the darkness stumbling over skeletons which lay on the floor. It was plastered with curious biblical painting and extraordinary wood carvings of deepest bas-relief covered with gold leaf. Some of these we annexed, as it had been done before and would be again, and we might as well get our share. That is the only excuse. With unlimited transportation facilities, I would have taken it all, the beautiful and the grotesque. The priest caught the fever and appropriated 2 Greek Bibles of 1562 and 1620. Leaving the lieutenant there, we wandered through the town and located the only inhabitants, an old man and his wife, apparently guardians of the other churches and monasteries. How they lived there, I don't know. In one monastery was a grisly crop of skeletons, plied to the ceiling of the crypt like firewood, probably an old charnel house. But those 2 old people were the only human beings we saw. That's it.